I run Common Press with Jim Hinks, and Common Press is a short fiction specialist publishing house. We're very interested, and have been for a long time, in bringing together the two worlds of the two sort of disciplines of literary writers, poets, and fiction writers with scientists. And we've published a number of writers who are very interested in this field, and we've worked on previous books, a poetry science collaboration with Diana Sider. And last year we did a book called When It Changed, which was an exercise in bringing 15 writers together with 15 research scientists. The writers visited them in their place of worship, their place of research, and they kind of spent a day imbibing and assimilating the scientists' perspective, their language, their imaginative apparatus, and their hardcore theory. And then they went away and wrote 15 short stories based on these, on that kind of language and what they took from those meetings. And then the scientists sort of fact-checked the stories and wrote afterwards, responding to little pieces afterwards, just responding to the stories. With this book, which is an ongoing project sponsored by at the Institute of Physics and Manchester Beacon, the emphasis is slightly different. We've asked scientists to talk and nominate specific moments from scientific history, Eureka moments, turning points, breakthroughs, accidental discoveries, and so forth, and try and get the writers to explore, recreate, and retell those moments of discovery from various different angles. It's part of a wider project. Tim O'Brien consulted on two stories by Sarah Maitland and Adam Marek. James Sumner consulted on Zoe's story, and a scientist called Rob Appleby, a physicist, consulted on Stella's story. The format for this evening is I'm going to ask the writers to Zoe to read her first story, and then James to talk a little bit about his input into that story, and then Stella's going to read her story, and then Tim's going to talk a little bit about his work. Just to introduce the writers to start with, Zoe's a young writer, a Manchester-based writer who's worked a lot for Common, written a number of short stories for us. She's a graduate of the UEA Creative Writing School. She teaches creative writing in Bolton, and she has her debut collection due out with Common Press at the end of this year. Stella Duffy is an award-winning novelist, playwright, theatre director, short story writer, crime novelist, multi-talented writer, who we've had the pleasure of working with before as well. James Sumner is a historian of science. He's asked me to clarify that he's not a scientist, he's a historian of science, specialising in physics with a physics background. He's based at the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine at the University of Manchester. And Tim O'Brien is an astrophysicist and outreach officer based at the Jodrell Bank. And he has possibly the best job description imaginable, which is he looks for exploding galaxies. Is that right?
Almost.
I always get that bit wrong. So, as I say, we're going to start with Zoe, who's going to read an excerpt from her story, which is exploring the story of Lisa Meitner, who is a relatively unknown figure and sometimes forgotten about figure in the history of nuclear fission, the discovery of fission, and the seismic changes that were going on in the application of physics in the 1930s and 40s. Please welcome Zoe Lambert.
It's quite nice coming from Lancaster Lit Fest because I've just heard two other writers' stories that are going to be in this anthology, and it's interesting because we've all approached writing about this moment of Eureka and science in very, very different ways. And in my story, I'm probably quite literal. My imagination is very literal, and I heard Lisa Meitner's story. And what was going on at the time of the discovery was so fascinating and so caught up with the politics of the time that I've kind of very much stuck to the facts, and there's a lot of science in it, I do warn you. Hope you're taking notes.
You'll be tested afterwards.
I'll test you afterwards. There'll be a quiz, and I might write things on the board. So this story's ended up really long, actually, really, really long. So I'm just going to read the opening bit and then a section later in the story, so I might do a little summary of the bit in between. So hopefully it'll make sense, I don't know. Anyway, the story is called Beautiful Results. The Jewess endangers the Institute. That's what Kurt Hess has been saying. Otto Hahn was walking back and forth in front of Lisa's desk. She ignored him and continued writing up the results. She'd already heard what Hess had said, what they were all saying about her. Otto leant on her desk, perspiration pricking his forehead. Lisa, are you listening? I lost my nerve and talked to Horline about this foolish situation. Something needed to be done about you and Hess. Lisa dipped a pen in the ink. She couldn't account for their results with thorium any more than she could with uranium. The reaction of fast neutrons with thorium resulted in 3 different decay series. It didn't seem possible. Horline said you may have to resign. Perhaps you could stay on an unofficial capacity, though he insisted you need to vacate your apartment. What? And where am I supposed to go? Hotel Adlon. Hotel Adlon. She stared at the desk and said quietly, I don't know why you had to say anything to Horline at all. I'm sorry, Lisa. I'm worried about the Institute. I know you are. Lisa pretended to write till Otto had left the room and his footsteps had disappeared down the corridor. She couldn't believe he had gone and spoken about her. The air in her office felt still and empty. She was alone in this institute, utterly alone. She couldn't just sit here, so she gathered her coat and walked through the grounds towards her apartment, picking away over the patches of snow. The trees and greenery were usually calming and blocked out the street vendors and trams of Dahlem, but she could still hear a parade. She'd managed to carry on working at the Institute, putting up with the more difficult party members vying for her position and twittering on about the greatness of Aryan physics. But now Austria had been annexed, and for this she was supposed to gracefully resign, as if she had done something wrong, when she'd worked in this institute for 30 years. Her feet sank in the deep patch of snow, so she lifted her skirts and stood under a tree where the grass was dry. There, she took out her Austrian passport out of her bag and flipped through the pages. The passport no longer existed or mattered, like some outdated theory. Lisa was, in effect, back where she had started in 1908, when the entire Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry had been off-limits to women. What if you set fire to your hair in the laboratories? Emil Fischer had asked, not unkindly. It had been dear Otto who had suggested that they work together in an old carpenter's shop in the basement, where he had set up equipment to measure radiation. It had a separate outside entrance, so she could go to a restaurant down the street to use the toilet. She liked Otto immediately, his sociability and willingness to work with a woman, even his upturned moustache, and they'd always worked well together. In 1918, with Otto returning from the front, they discovered the radioactive element protactinium, the element just before uranium in the periodic table. And now the race was on to explain various strange observations that seemed to indicate still heavier elements out in the mysterious zone beyond uranium, the transuranes. She found a packet of cigarettes in her bag, lit one and leant against the tree. She could have left when Albert and everyone else had 5 years earlier, but Otto had promised her that this department would be different. They could keep working together despite the race laws. But now Otto, dearest Otto, had in effect kicked her out of the Institute.